Sir, don't plug that USB into the screen. The whisper was so soft it should have disappeared beneath the applause. Yet somehow it struck Alexander Whitmore harder than the thunder of 1,000 boardroom arguments. His hand froze less than an inch above the polished silver flash drive resting beside the microphone. The ballroom inside the Grand Crescent Hotel shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, their warm light reflecting across marble floors and rows of dark suits worth more than most families earned in a lifetime. More than 600 investors, executives, reporters, and government regulators had gathered for what financial networks had already called the biggest corporate announcement of the decade. Cameras lined the back wall. Television crews adjusted their lenses. Every second of the presentation would be broadcast live across America. Alexander, 47 years old, founder and CEO of Whitmore Global Holdings, had built a reputation for seeing opportunities no one else could find. Wall Street admired him. Silicon Valley feared him. Employees described him as brilliant but impossible to surprise. Yet at that very moment, the only thing holding his attention was the quiet voice of a little girl standing beside the audiovisual control table. She couldn't have been older than 9. Her dark brown eyes remained fixed on the small silver USB drive lying beside his presentation laptop. Her neat braided hair was tied together with tiny purple ribbons that matched the faded friendship bracelet wrapped around one wrist. Her oversized gray hoodie clearly belonged to someone much older, and the conference badge hanging from her neck was turned backward, making her look even smaller among the sea of expensive tailored jackets. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the stage. Alexander slowly lowered his hand without taking his eyes off the child. "What did you say?" he asked quietly enough that the nearest microphone couldn't catch the words. The girl swallowed once before answering. "That USB isn't yours." The room continued buzzing with anticipation, unaware that the richest man in the building had stopped listening to everyone except one child. "Hey." Producer counted down with his fingers from 10. Large LED screens displayed the Whitmore Global logo above the words "Tomorrow begins today." Investors smiled confidently. Reporters prepared headlines before the announcement had even begun. Near the front row, Victor Hale adjusted his navy tie and checked his watch with practiced calm. As Whitmore Global's chief financial officer, Victor had spent months preparing today's presentation. Every chart, every projection, every contract waiting to be signed had passed through his office. His expression remained perfectly composed, but his eyes flickered toward the little girl for barely a second before returning to Alexander. It was such a tiny movement that almost nobody noticed. Maya Johnson did. She had noticed everything since arriving with her mother before sunrise. Her mom, Denise, worked nights with the hotel's cleaning crew whenever major conventions rented the ballroom. School was closed for a teacher workshop, so Maya had quietly spent the morning reading library books near the backstage storage room while her mother polished windows and emptied trash bins. Adults often forgot children were paying attention. Maya never forgot what adults said when they believed nobody important was listening. About an hour earlier, she had watched 2 men step into the equipment room carrying identical silver USB drives. One of them had been Victor Hale. She didn't recognize the other man, only that he wore black gloves despite the warm June weather. They spoke in hurried whispers. She hadn't understood every business term, but one sentence refused to leave her mind. Once the presentation starts, the original file disappears forever. Then Victor had laughed softly before replacing one USB with another that looked exactly the same except for one detail. Maya remembered seeing a tiny purple thread caught beneath the cap of the original drive after it accidentally brushed against a decorative ribbon on a gift basket. The USB now resting beside Alexander's laptop had no purple thread at all. She had tried convincing herself she misunderstood. Maybe there had been 2 identical drives. Maybe executives switched files all the time. But the nervous look on Victor's face had stayed with her. Then she noticed him quietly watching Alexander reach toward the USB. Something inside her refused to stay silent. "Sir," she whispered again, barely breathing the words, "please don't use that one." Alexander looked from the drive to Maya, then back again. He had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without hesitation, but uncertainty now settled quietly inside him. His instincts had built an empire, and those same instincts told him this child wasn't trying to attract attention. She looked frightened only that he might ignore her. Across the ballroom, The master of ceremonies smiled toward the cameras. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on this historic morning. Please welcome the founder of Whitmore Global, Mr. Alexander Whitmore. Applause rolled across the ballroom like distant thunder. Alexander stepped toward the podium, but left the USB exactly where it was. Victor's smile tightened almost invisibly. Maya noticed that too. As Alexander reached the microphone, he glanced once more toward the little girl standing alone beside the equipment table. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She simply placed one small hand over the faded purple bracelet around her wrist and silently shook her head, her eyes never leaving the harmless-looking silver USB that glittered beneath the ballroom lights like an ordinary piece of plastic, while quietly waiting for someone powerful enough to trust the wrong choice. Alexander Whitmore let the applause settle before raising one calm hand toward the audience. The ballroom immediately grew quieter. Hundreds of conversations faded into complete silence as every camera focused on the stage. He offered the confident smile investors expected from him, but his thoughts remained fixed on the little girl standing near the audiovisual station. For the first time in years, he chose not to follow the presentation exactly as planned. "Before we begin," he said evenly, "I would like to thank everyone for traveling here today. Some of you came from New York. Some flew in from California, Texas, Illinois, and overseas. Your confidence in Whitmore Global has never been taken for granted." A ripple of polite applause echoed through the ballroom. Alexander rested one hand lightly on the podium while his other remained deliberately away from the silver USB drive. The change seemed insignificant to everyone except two people. Maya noticed it immediately. Victor Hale did as well. Victor maintained his polished smile, yet a faint tension settled across his jaw. He leaned toward the event coordinator seated beside him and whispered something almost impossible to hear. Seconds later, one of the hotel security supervisors quietly began walking toward the audiovisual area where Maya stood. She noticed him approaching but did not move. Her fingers tightened around the faded purple bracelet on her wrist as she watched Alexander continue speaking. "Innovation," Alexander continued, "has never been about technology alone. It begins with trust." The word trust lingered in the air longer than expected. Victor's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Near the back of the ballroom, Denise Johnson had just finished replacing fresh water pitchers along the conference tables when she finally spotted her daughter standing beside the stage. Her heart skipped. Maya had promised to remain in the employee lounge while Denise completed her shift. Without attracting attention, Denise hurried along the side aisle, hoping to quietly bring her daughter away before anyone complained. She never reached her. The security supervisor arrived first. He bent slightly, so his voice would remain respectful. "Hello there. Are you here with your family?" Maya nodded. "Yes, sir. Can I help you find your mother?" Maya looked toward the stage instead of answering. "I need to tell him something first." The supervisor smiled kindly. "Mr. Whitmore is a little busy right now." "I know. Then maybe afterward." Maya slowly shook her head. "It has to be before he uses that drive." The supervisor followed her gaze toward the podium, then looked back at the child with gentle confusion. "Sweetheart, I think everything is under control." Maya lowered her voice even further. "That is what the other man wants everyone to believe." The supervisor hesitated. Her answer did not sound like imagination. It sounded certain. Across the ballroom, Victor rose from his chair with practiced confidence and walked toward the stage carrying a leather portfolio. His movements appeared completely natural, almost expected for the chief financial officer moments before a major presentation. He smiled warmly at Alexander. "Everything is ready," Victor said into the microphone with effortless charm. "The presentation file is loaded exactly as we rehearsed yesterday." Alexander met his eyes for a brief moment. "Excellent." Victor reached toward the laptop. "Would you like me to start the slides?" "Not yet." Victor withdrew his hand gracefully, though disappointment flashed across his face before disappearing beneath another professional smile. "Of course." Maya noticed every second of the exchange. She remembered the equipment room. She remembered Victor holding two identical USB drives beneath the fluorescent lights. She remembered him saying that the original file would disappear forever. She could not explain what those words meant, but she knew they had frightened her enough to remember them exactly. Denise finally reached her daughter and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Maya," she whispered anxiously, "what are you doing here?" Maya looked up. Mom, I think somebody switched his USB. Denise's expression changed instantly. She glanced toward the stage before kneeling beside her daughter. Honey, those are important business people. You cannot accuse someone unless you know for certain. I know what I saw. Denise smiled gently, brushing one braid behind Maya's ear. Sometimes grown-up meetings are confusing. Maya looked disappointed but remained calm. It was not confusing. Before Denise could answer, Victor approached them with remarkable friendliness. Everything all right over here? He asked pleasantly. Denise immediately stood. I am very sorry, sir. She was just leaving. Victor offered Maya a reassuring smile that looked perfect to everyone else. No harm done. Conferences can be exciting. His eyes settled on Maya for only a heartbeat. Sometimes our imaginations become more exciting than reality. Maya quietly answered, I do not think this is imagination. Victor chuckled softly as though amused by a child's curiosity. I appreciate that. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small wrapped chocolate from the hospitality table. Here, thank you for keeping our guests company today. Maya did not take it. Victor waited another second before slipping it back into his pocket. His smile never disappeared, but something colder briefly appeared behind his eyes. Alexander watched the interaction from the stage. He could not hear the conversation, yet one detail bothered him. The child had not accepted the gift. Most children would have. Instead, she had looked directly at Victor without fear. Investors began checking their watches. Television producers signaled that the live broadcast schedule was slipping. The master of ceremonies quietly reminded Alexander they needed to begin the financial presentation immediately. Alexander nodded once before looking toward the laptop again. The silver USB remained exactly where it had been since the morning. Untouched. Waiting. Somewhere deep inside him, a question refused to disappear. If the little girl had invented the entire story, why had the most confident executive in his company spent the last several minutes trying so carefully to convince everyone that nothing at all was wrong? Ignoring the growing impatience inside the ballroom, Alexander Whitmore stepped away from the podium instead of beginning the presentation. A quiet wave of confusion spread through the audience. Investors exchanged puzzled glances while television producers looked toward one another for answers. Alexander stopped beside the conference table where the silver USB still rested untouched. He studied it for several long seconds before lifting his eyes toward Maya. The room noticed. Hundreds of faces followed his gaze until they landed on the small girl standing beside her mother near the audiovisual station. Denise looked ready to apologize again, but Alexander spoke before she could. Young lady, he said in a calm voice that echoed gently through the ballroom. Would you mind coming over here? Maya looked at her mother. Denise hesitated before giving the smallest nod she could manage. Maya walked slowly across the polished marble floor. The sound of her worn sneakers seemed strangely loud inside the silent ballroom. Every expensive suit, every television camera, every executive now watched a 9-year-old girl approach one of the most powerful business leaders in America. She stopped several feet away from Alexander and folded her hands together. She did not look frightened anymore. She simply looked determined. Alexander lowered himself slightly so they could speak comfortably without forcing her to look up. Tell me exactly what made you stop me. Maya glanced toward the USB before answering. Because that is not the same one. A few reporters quietly raised their cameras. Victor Hale let out a polite laugh that drifted through the room. Children notice all kinds of interesting things, he said pleasantly. She probably saw another flash drive somewhere earlier today. Alexander did not look away from Maya. How do you know this one is different? Maya answered immediately. The real one had a purple thread caught under the cap. A murmur passed through the audience. Alexander looked carefully at the USB lying on the table. There was no purple thread. Victor smiled again. Mr. Whitmore, there are thousands of identical drives sold every day. A child could easily confuse one with another. Maya quietly shook her head. I did not confuse it. Alexander remained silent. Can you explain? Maya took a slow breath. My mom was cleaning the hallway near the equipment room. I was reading my library book outside because she told me to stay where she could see me. Two men walked into the room carrying silver USB drives. One of them was Mr. Hale. Victor's smile remained fixed. Coincidence. I was preparing the presentation. Maya continued without raising her voice. One drive slipped onto the table and brushed against a basket with purple ribbon. A little piece got stuck under the cap. I noticed because I thought it looked funny. Several people leaned closer. Even Denise looked surprised. Maya reached into the pocket of her oversized hoodie. I picked it up after they left. She carefully opened her hand. Resting across her small palm was a tiny strand of purple ribbon no longer than an inch. The color matched the decorative ribbons still tied around the welcome baskets displayed throughout the ballroom. Alexander accepted the thread carefully between two fingers. It weighed almost nothing, yet somehow the room felt heavier. Maya pointed toward the USB. If that is the same one, the ribbon should still be there because it was caught inside when he closed the cap. Alexander slowly examined the drive without opening it. There was no ribbon. Victor answered almost immediately. That proves nothing. Ribbon can fall off. It can be removed accidentally. We are delaying a major financial announcement because of a loose piece of decoration. His voice remained smooth, but the confidence sounded slightly rehearsed now. Maya looked directly at Alexander. There is something else. Go ahead, Alexander said gently. When they thought nobody was listening, the other man asked if anyone would notice. Mr. Hale said no because everyone only watches the screen, not the USB. The ballroom became completely still. Victor's eyes narrowed for the briefest instant before he recovered. Mr. Whitmore, with respect, this is becoming ridiculous. She is repeating fragments of a conversation she could not possibly understand. Maya nodded honestly. That part is true. I did not understand everything. She paused before adding, but I remember exactly what I heard because it sounded important. Alexander folded the tiny purple thread inside his palm. What were the exact words? Maya closed her eyes for 1 second, as if replaying the memory. Then she repeated them carefully. Once the presentation starts, the original file disappears forever. Then the other man asked if the numbers would match. Mr. Hale smiled and said 9 billion, clean before midnight. The final sentence settled over the ballroom like winter air. No one applauded. No one whispered. Even the camera operators stopped adjusting their equipment. Grace Bennett, Whitmore Global's chief legal counsel, slowly stood from her seat near the front row. She had spent 20 years listening to witness statements, depositions, and courtroom testimony. Children often forgot details. Honest witnesses usually remembered unusual phrases exactly as they had heard them. She looked first at Maya, then toward Victor, whose smile had finally disappeared. Alexander noticed it immediately. Without saying another word, he picked up the untouched USB with one hand, kept the tiny purple ribbon in the other, and turned toward Grace Bennett. Before this device goes anywhere near my computer, he said quietly, I want you to verify every single file inside it. Right now, in a separate room, offline, and nobody touches it until you do. Grace Bennett accepted the silver USB without hesitation, holding it only by its edges before placing it inside a small evidence envelope that one of the technology specialists quickly handed her. She looked directly at Alexander Whitmore. I will examine it on an isolated computer with no network connection. Nothing will be copied, transmitted, or opened on any company system until I know exactly what is inside. Alexander gave a single nod. Thank you. She walked calmly toward a private conference room accompanied by the head of cybersecurity and 2 members of the legal department. The ballroom remained unusually quiet as every eye followed them through the closing glass doors. For the first time since the event had begun, the enormous presentation screens displayed nothing except the Whitmore Global logo floating against a blue background. Investors shifted uneasily in their seats. Television anchors whispered updates into their microphones without understanding what had just happened. Victor Hale remained standing near the stage, his hands folded comfortably in front of him. Alexander, he said with a patient smile, we both understand the responsibility we carry toward our shareholders. Delaying this announcement because of an unverified story from a child could create unnecessary concern in the markets. Alexander turned toward him slowly. You are correct about one thing. Victor's smile widened slightly. Responsibility matters. Exactly. Alexander looked across the room before returning his attention to Victor, which is why I intend to verify every fact before I ask millions of people to trust what appears on that screen. Victor spread his hands politely. Then allow the technology team to examine the drive. I have absolutely nothing to hide. Maya listened quietly from beside her mother. Something about Victor's voice felt different now. Earlier it had sounded smooth and confident. Now every sentence seemed carefully measured, as though he had rehearsed every possible answer long before anyone asked the questions. Alexander stepped closer until only a few feet separated the two men. Their conversation remained calm, yet the silence surrounding them made every word feel heavier. "Help me understand something," Alexander said. "Why did you walk toward my laptop the moment I delayed the presentation?" Victor answered without pause. "Because I believed you wanted me to begin the slides. That is my responsibility as Chief Financial Officer. And when I said not yet, I stepped away immediately." Alexander nodded thoughtfully. "You did." Victor relaxed his shoulders slightly. "Then I failed to see the concern." Alexander continued. "Why did you personally approach the child afterward?" Victor chuckled softly. "To reassure a nervous little girl who seemed overwhelmed by the size of the event. Surely that is not suspicious." Maya looked up at Alexander before quietly speaking. "He offered me chocolate." Several guests smiled gently at the innocent detail. Victor laughed. "Exactly. Hardly the behavior of someone hiding a crime." Maya continued in the same calm voice. "When I did not take it, he stopped smiling with his eyes." The sentence landed with surprising weight. Denise glanced down at her daughter, realizing she had been observing far more than anyone imagined. Victor's expression remained controlled, but he did not laugh again. Alexander noticed that as well. "Children often recognize sincerity better than adults do," Alexander said quietly. Victor answered with measured confidence. "Children also misunderstand situations because they naturally fill missing information with imagination." Maya shook her head. "I do not know much about business." She looked directly at Victor. "But I know when someone says they hope nobody is watching." Victor immediately replied. "Did you actually hear me say that?" Maya frowned slightly. "No." Victor turned toward Alexander. "There you have it." Before he could continue, Maya finished her sentence. "The other man said it. You answered. Everybody watches the screen." A low murmur spread across the audience again. Victor's breathing remained steady, yet a faint line appeared across his forehead. Alexander folded his arms. "Is she remembering correctly?" Victor met his gaze. "I have participated in dozens of confidential meetings. Any words she believes she heard have clearly been misunderstood or taken out of context." "Then tell me the context." Victor hesitated for the first time. It lasted barely a second, but Alexander had built an empire by recognizing hesitation during billion-dollar negotiations. "I do not remember every private conversation from this morning," Victor finally answered. Alexander's eyes remained fixed on him. "Interesting. Why?" "Because Maya remembers a sentence word for word, yet you cannot remember whether you even had the conversation." Before Victor could respond, the ballroom doors opened. Grace Bennett returned carrying the sealed evidence envelope. Her face remained professional, revealing nothing. She walked directly toward Alexander. Every reporter stood. Every investor leaned forward. Even Maya held her breath. Grace stopped beside Alexander and spoke quietly enough that only those nearest the stage could hear. "I have not opened any presentation files." Victor immediately smiled. "Excellent. Then we can finally proceed." Grace looked directly at him. "Because I found something before opening them." The smile disappeared. Grace carefully placed the USB on the podium without removing it from its protective envelope. The storage capacity printed on the outside of this device does not match the hardware identification embedded inside it. Alexander frowned. "Explain." "Someone altered the casing. The shell says one thing. The internal hardware identifies itself as something completely different. That alone justifies a full forensic examination before anyone inserts it into any computer." The room fell silent. Once again, Grace looked from Alexander to Victor. "Whether this is innocent or intentional, I cannot say yet." She paused before adding one final sentence that caused every executive in the front row to exchange uneasy glances. "But I can say with complete confidence that this USB did not leave the manufacturer in the condition it is in today." Alexander Whitmore remained silent for several seconds after Grace Bennett finished speaking. The silence itself carried more weight than any dramatic reaction could have. 600 guests waited for an answer that did not come. Instead, Alexander slowly reached for the microphone and addressed the ballroom with the same calm authority that had guided his company through decades of uncertainty. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Transparency has always been the foundation of Whitmore Global. Because of that commitment, today's presentation will be temporarily delayed while our legal and cybersecurity teams complete a verification process. Every guest will be escorted to the reception lounge where refreshments have been prepared. We appreciate your understanding. The announcement surprised the audience, yet no one objected. Investors valued confidence, but they valued honesty even more. Conversations quietly resumed as hotel staff opened the ballroom's side doors and politely guided guests toward the adjoining reception hall overlooking the city skyline. Television crews continued filming from a distance while reporters began making careful notes instead of rushing to conclusions. Within 10 minutes, the grand ballroom that had been filled with hundreds of voices felt strangely empty. Only Alexander, Grace Bennett, Victor Hale, Maya Johnson, Denise Johnson, several members of the cybersecurity team, and a handful of senior executives remained inside. The enormous room suddenly seemed much larger without the crowd. Crystal chandeliers reflected across the polished marble floor, and the faint sound of piano music drifted in from the hotel lobby beyond the closed doors. Alexander turned toward Denise. "Ms. Johnson, I owe you an apology. Neither you nor your daughter expected to become part of this." "Morning." Denise lowered her eyes respectfully. She only spoke because she believed someone needed to hear her. Alexander looked at Maya. "I am grateful she did." Maya offered a small nod, but said nothing. She appeared more relieved than proud. Grace carefully placed the sealed USB inside a locked evidence case. "I have requested a complete forensic workstation from our headquarters. It should arrive within 30 minutes. Until then, I recommend nobody attempts to access this device." Alexander agreed immediately. Victor folded his arms. "I support a thorough investigation. However, I must remind everyone that every minute of delay affects the company's public reputation." Grace answered calmly. "Our reputation would suffer far more if we ignored legitimate security concerns." Victor smiled politely. "I simply hope we are not allowing coincidence to become suspicion." Alexander studied him carefully before speaking. "Coincidence deserves verification. Truth does not fear examination." No one argued with that. A hotel employee quietly entered carrying a tray of bottled water before quickly leaving again. Maya accepted one bottle after Denise encouraged her to drink. Alexander noticed the girl's hands were still remarkably steady. Most adults would have appeared nervous after speaking before hundreds of powerful people. Maya simply looked thoughtful, as if she were trying to remember something important. Alexander walked closer. "Is there anything else you have not told us?" Maya stared toward the empty stage for several moments before answering. "Maybe." Denise looked surprised. "Honey." Maya frowned slightly. "I did not think it mattered before." Alexander spoke gently. "Tell me anyway." Maya looked toward the large presentation screens hanging above the stage. The other man asked if the backup would stay hidden. Grace immediately glanced toward Alexander. "Backup?" Maya nodded slowly. Mr. Hale answered that nobody would ever look because everybody trusts the numbers after they appear on the screen. Victor sighed quietly before shaking his head. "She is combining unrelated pieces of conversation into a story that sounds meaningful. Children naturally do that." Maya looked directly at him. "Then why do you remember what children do so well if you do not remember talking this morning?" The question caught everyone by surprise. Even Denise blinked. Victor opened his mouth before closing it again. Alexander noticed the brief hesitation. Grace noticed it too. Before anyone could continue, the head of cybersecurity hurried into the ballroom carrying a tablet computer. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, "I have something you should see." Alexander accepted the tablet. "Go ahead." After Ms. Bennett requested the forensic workstation, I reviewed today's building access logs. Nothing inside the USB itself. Only entry records. He tapped the screen. Every executive badge worked normally this morning except one. Victor remained perfectly still. Alexander read silently for several seconds. The access log showed that Victor Hale's identification badge had entered the secure server corridor twice before 7 o'clock that morning. The first entry lasted 4 minutes. The second lasted only 43 seconds. Alexander looked up. "Why were there 2 visits?" Victor answered smoothly. "I forgot a printed financial summary and went back to retrieve it." The cybersecurity director nodded respectfully. That explanation would make sense except the surveillance system shows nobody carrying paper when leaving the second time. Victor replied without missing a beat. Then I must have remembered the document was already inside my briefcase. Grace quietly extended her hand toward the tablet. May I? After reviewing the timestamps herself, she looked toward the cybersecurity director. Please preserve every access record from midnight until now. Do not modify or overwrite anything. Already completed, he answered. Alexander slowly handed the tablet back. The evidence remained entirely circumstantial, yet each new detail seemed to fit beside the previous one like pieces of a puzzle no one had realized they were assembling. Maya looked at the stage once more. I think there is one more thing. Everyone turned toward her again. She pointed toward the large presentation monitor suspended above the empty ballroom. The other man kept saying, they only had one chance because once that screen showed the numbers, people would believe them before asking questions. Alexander followed her gaze upward. For the first time that morning, he stopped looking at the USB and began looking at the screen that had almost displayed whatever someone wanted the world to see. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed completely. What had begun as a celebration of growth now felt like a careful search for truth. No one raised their voice. No one rushed toward conclusions. Every decision became deliberate. Alexander Whitmore slowly walked toward the massive presentation stage and looked up at the towering LED display that dominated the room. For years, he had trusted technology to communicate facts with perfect accuracy. Today, for the first time, he questioned whether the screen itself had almost become part of a deception. Grace Bennett stepped beside him. If the display system was intended to reinforce false financial data, then the USB may only be one piece of a much larger plan. Alexander nodded thoughtfully. Can the presentation server be isolated before anyone accesses it? The head of cybersecurity answered immediately. Already done. Every external connection has been disabled. The ballroom network is now separated from the rest of the building. Good, Alexander replied. Nobody touches a single presentation file until we understand everything. Victor Hale folded his hands calmly. I completely support protecting company systems. However, we are creating the impression that Whitmore Global has suffered a security breach before we have any evidence that such a breach exists. Grace answered without emotion. Investigating unusual evidence does not create panic. Ignoring it does. Victor smiled politely, but remained silent. Maya stood quietly beside her mother, watching the adults move through the ballroom. She noticed something none of them seemed to notice. One of the presentation laptops remained connected beneath the stage, its power indicator glowing softly. Earlier that morning, a technician had closed the lid after rehearsals, yet nobody had disconnected it. Maya looked toward Alexander. Sir. He turned immediately. Yes, Maya. She pointed beneath the podium. That computer is still awake. Everyone looked toward the stage. The cybersecurity director walked over, crouched beside the podium, and gently lifted the laptop without opening it. Interesting, he murmured. It should have entered sleep mode by now. Grace frowned. Do not wake it yet. The director nodded. I will remove the battery power only after documenting its current state. He photographed the screen, the cables, every connection, and the serial number before carefully placing the computer inside another evidence container. Alexander watched each step with approval. Chain of custody begins now. Every device, every cable, every storage drive gets documented. The director smiled slightly. Already in progress. Denise looked down at Maya. How did you notice that? Maya shrugged softly. The little light was blinking differently. The cybersecurity director overheard her answer. She's right. Earlier, it was blinking slowly. Now it is steady. Grace turned toward him. What does that mean? It usually means a process is still running. Victor quietly cleared his throat. Modern computers perform automatic background tasks all the time. Sometimes, the director answered. Sometimes they do something else. Alexander looked toward the empty rows of chairs stretching across the ballroom. Can that laptop communicate with the presentation screens without the USB? Possibly, the director admitted, depending on how today's system was configured. Grace looked toward Victor. Who approved the audio-visual configuration? Victor answered smoothly. I signed the event request because finance handled today's budget. The installation itself was performed by an outside contractor. Do you know the contractor? Grace asked. Only by company name. Please provide every document connected with today's event. Of course. Victor reached into his leather portfolio and handed over a neatly organized folder without hesitation. Grace accepted it, but did not open it immediately. Instead, she passed it directly to another attorney. Catalog every page before reviewing anything. Alexander noticed Victor watching the folder leave his hands. It was only a glance, but it lasted just long enough to suggest concern. Maya noticed it too. She quietly tugged on Denise's sleeve. "Mom." Denise leaned closer. "What is it?" Maya whispered. "He keeps watching papers instead of people." Denise looked toward Victor, then back at her daughter. She had never thought about the difference before. Alexander slowly approached Maya once more. "You have helped us more than you know today." Maya looked down at her shoes. "I just remembered something because everybody keeps talking about papers." Alexander waited patiently. When the other man asked if everything matched, Mr. Hale said, "The files, the screens, and the printed reports all tell the same story." Grace immediately looked toward the unopened folder. Printed reports. Alexander turned toward one of the executive assistants. "Were financial packets distributed before the presentation?" "Yes, sir. Every guest received one when they checked in." Grace's expression sharpened. "Retrieve every remaining packet before anyone leaves the hotel." The assistant hurried toward the reception lounge. Within minutes, several unopened presentation folders were placed across the conference table. Grace carefully compared the printed financial summaries against archived reports stored securely on her encrypted tablet. She read silently for nearly a minute before looking up. "Alexander." "Yes." "The printed reports contain numbers that do not match the board-approved version from last night." No one spoke. Grace continued calmly. "The differences are subtle. Most readers would never notice them during a live presentation because they appear reasonable at first glance." Alexander slowly exhaled, meaning if the presentation had continued. Grace finished the thought quietly. The audience would have seen matching numbers on the screen, inside the printed reports, and very likely inside the altered USB as well. 3 independent sources appearing to confirm one another. The cybersecurity director looked toward the sealed evidence containers lined across the table. Someone understood that people trust information when multiple sources appear to agree. Alexander remained completely still. Then he looked toward Maya, whose small purple bracelet rested quietly against her sleeve beneath the brilliant ballroom lights. "You did not stop one suspicious USB this morning," he said softly. "You may have interrupted an entire illusion before the world ever had the chance to believe it." Grace Bennett closed the comparison folder with deliberate care and placed it beside the sealed evidence cases. No one reached for the documents again. The numbers printed inside them no longer looked like ordinary financial reports. They looked like pieces of a carefully arranged puzzle. Alexander Whitmore slowly walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Morning sunlight reflected across the skyline, but he barely noticed it. He had spent decades building trust one decision at a time. The possibility that someone inside his own executive team had tried to manipulate that trust weighed heavily on him. Behind him, Victor Hale remained remarkably composed. "Alexander," he said calmly, "I believe we are allowing coincidence to build a narrative that does not exist. Minor differences between draft reports happen before every major presentation. That is why we review materials." Grace answered before Alexander could speak. "These were not draft reports. The board approved final versions last night." Victor nodded. "Then perhaps someone in the printing department received an outdated file." Grace looked directly at him. "The printing department only receives files authorized through your office." Victor smiled politely. "Then we should interview everyone involved before assuming intent." Alexander turned away from the windows. "We will." His voice remained calm, but something had changed. Earlier, he had been searching for explanations. Now he was measuring every answer against the growing weight of the evidence. A quiet vibration interrupted the silence. One of the cybersecurity analysts looked down at his secured tablet before raising his eyes toward Grace. "We have another update." Grace motioned for him to continue. "The ballroom presentation laptop never connected to the internet this morning." Victor immediately nodded. "Exactly. That supports everything I have been saying." The analyst continued without changing his expression. "However, it did communicate with another storage device approximately 12 minutes before guests entered the ballroom." Victor's smile faded slightly. Alexander stepped closer. "Can you identify the device?" "Not completely. The connection log was partially erased." Grace folded her arms. "Partially? Yes. Most automatic system logs are either present or absent. This one appears to have been selectively removed. Alexander asked quietly, "Can deleted records be recovered?" "Possibly. Our forensic team is already working on it." Maya listened carefully. She looked toward the stage again before speaking in her usual gentle voice. "Maybe they forgot something." Every adult turned toward her. Alexander smiled softly. "What do you mean?" Maya pointed toward the welcome table where decorative gift baskets still stood untouched. "When people hurry, they remember the big things first." Grace followed Maya's finger. Nothing appeared unusual. Then Maya continued. "The purple ribbon came from one of those baskets. If someone changed the USB there, maybe they left something else behind too." Grace exchanged a glance with the cybersecurity director. "Search the entire preparation area exactly as it was left this morning. Photograph everything before moving it." Several investigators immediately began examining the stage, equipment tables, extension cables, gift baskets, and supply carts. No one rushed. Every object was documented before it was touched. Denise watched her daughter with quiet amazement. "How did you think of that?" Maya shrugged gently. "My grandmother always says people clean what everyone can see first." Nearly 15 minutes passed before one of the investigators called from behind the presentation backdrop. "Ms. Bennett, I found something." Everyone walked toward the rear of the stage. Resting beneath a narrow equipment table was a small transparent plastic cap designed to fit over the end of a USB drive. It looked ordinary except for one detail. Caught inside the hinge was a tiny strand of purple ribbon. Grace carefully photographed it before placing it into a labeled evidence bag. She looked toward Alexander. "If this cap belongs to the original USB Maya described, then her account becomes independently supported." Victor spoke immediately. "Or it belongs to any other flash drive carried by hundreds of conference staff." Grace nodded calmly. "That possibility will also be tested." She never argued. She simply collected facts. The investigators continued searching. A few moments later, another analyst approached carrying a small maintenance clipboard recovered from the audiovisual storage room. "This may be relevant." Alexander accepted it. The checklist showed every piece of equipment installed before sunrise, along with employee signatures confirming completion. Most entries appeared routine until Grace noticed one blank line where the serial number for the presentation USB should have been recorded. "Who was responsible for documenting this?" she asked. The analyst checked the work order. According to the schedule, final verification required approval from the event finance coordinator. Grace slowly lifted her eyes toward Victor. "That position reported directly to your office." Victor answered without hesitation. "Hundreds of documents pass through my department every week. Missing paperwork does not prove misconduct." "No," Alexander replied quietly. "But complete paperwork usually prevents questions like these." Before anyone could continue, the cybersecurity analyst's tablet chimed once more. He looked at the recovered data, then inhaled slowly. "We restored part of the deleted connection log." The room fell silent again. "What did you find?" Alexander asked. The analyst turned the screen so everyone could see. The unidentified storage device connected to the presentation laptop had a custom volume label. Grace leaned closer. "Can you read it?" Only part of it survived. He enlarged the recovered text. Across the damaged log, one incomplete name remained visible between missing characters. It read, Mercy_backup. Maya's eyes widened. She immediately looked at Grace. "Mercy." Grace met her gaze. "That is the same name you remembered earlier." Maya nodded. Slowly, "I told you there was a hidden file called Mercy." Alexander looked from the recovered log to the small evidence bag containing the USB cap with its tiny purple ribbon. One memory had become two. Two had become five. Each independent discovery quietly confirmed the next. And for the first time that morning, Victor Hale did not offer another explanation. Grace Bennett kept her eyes on the recovered system log for several long seconds before placing the tablet carefully on the conference table beside the sealed evidence bags. Nobody spoke. The silence inside the ballroom felt different now. Earlier it had been filled with uncertainty. Now it carried the quiet weight of evidence beginning to fit together. Alexander Whitmore looked toward the cybersecurity team. "Can the recovered information be verified independently?" The lead analyst nodded. "Yes." The deleted log was reconstructed from temporary system records stored outside the primary operating files. We can reproduce the recovery process in front of auditors if necessary. Grace gave a slight nod. Good. Every step must be repeatable. Victor Hale finally broke the silence. Alexander, we now have a child recalling fragments of a conversation, an unidentified USB cap, incomplete computer logs, and assumptions connecting unrelated events. None of this proves intent. Alexander answered calmly. No. But together they justify continuing the investigation. Victor spread his hands. Then let us investigate everything. I welcome it. His voice remained composed, but Maya noticed something small. He had stopped looking at Alexander. Instead, he kept glancing toward the closed conference room where the forensic workstation had been assembled. She quietly tugged on Grace's sleeve. Grace bent slightly. Yes, Maya? Maya whispered. He keeps looking at that room. Grace followed her gaze. Victor immediately shifted his attention elsewhere, but the observation stayed with her. Moments later, the door to the temporary forensic lab opened. A senior digital forensic examiner stepped into the ballroom, carrying a secured laptop. His expression remained professional, yet there was unmistakable urgency in his pace. Ms. Bennett, he said, we have completed the first read-only examination of the USB. Grace looked directly at him. Without executing any files. Correct. We examined only the directory structure and metadata. Alexander stepped closer. What did you find? The examiner placed the laptop on the conference table and rotated the screen toward them. The presentation contains 2 complete financial data sets. Victor immediately answered. That is normal. One is usually a backup. The examiner nodded politely. That was our initial assumption as well. He touched the keyboard once. However, both sets are labeled as final. Grace leaned closer. Explain the difference. The visible presentation contains revenue projections and asset values that differ substantially from the hidden archive stored elsewhere on the drive. The hidden archive matches last night's approved board documents. Alexander's expression remained steady, but his eyes sharpened. And the visible version? It reflects dramatically inflated valuation figures that would significantly change how investors viewed the company. The room became perfectly still. Victor spoke carefully. Someone could have copied outdated modeling files onto the drive accidentally. The examiner gently shook his head. That possibility became unlikely after we reviewed the edit history. Grace folded her arms. Go on. The hidden archive was created first. The visible presentation was generated afterward using many of the same source files. Someone intentionally replaced the approved numbers while preserving the overall appearance of the presentation. Alexander slowly asked, Can you determine when? Approximately 3 hours before today's event. Grace glanced toward the access logs already collected that morning. The timeline matched with remarkable precision. Victor remained calm. Metadata can be manipulated. Correct, the examiner answered. Which is why we checked something metadata cannot easily explain. He opened another report. The visible presentation references external spreadsheet files that no longer exist. The hidden archive references the official accounting database. Both cannot be the authentic. Final version. Maya listened quietly before speaking in her gentle voice. The fake one had to be shown first. Every adult looked toward her. Alexander smiled faintly. Why do you think that? Maya pointed toward the large presentation screens hanging above the empty ballroom. Because once people saw those numbers, they would remember them even if someone corrected them later. Grace slowly nodded. Anchoring bias. Denise looked confused. Grace smiled kindly. People often remember the first information they receive. Correcting it afterward is much harder. Alexander looked toward the dark presentation screens. Which means today's announcement itself was part of the strategy. The examiner continued. There is one more detail. He enlarged another technical report. The hidden archive was assigned an internal folder name. Grace's eyes narrowed slightly. Mercy. The examiner looked surprised. Yes. How did you know? Grace turned toward Maya. She told us hours ago. The examiner looked at the little girl with genuine amazement. Then her memory is remarkably accurate. He continued reading. The altered presentation was scheduled to open automatically. The authentic archive named Mercy would remain invisible during the live event unless someone intentionally searched for hidden directories. Alexander remained silent for several moments before speaking quietly, meaning the real financial records were never deleted. Correct, the examiner replied. They were concealed. Grace looked directly at Victor. Can you explain why an official investor presentation contained a concealed archive matching the board-approved version while the visible files displayed different financial data? Victor answered with measured confidence. I cannot explain technical decisions made by information technology staff without reviewing every development step. Before anyone could respond, the examiner added one final observation. Actually, the hidden archive contains a digital signature identifying the last authorized editor. Alexander lifted his eyes. Can you identify the account? Yes. The examiner clicked once more. A single line appeared on the screen beneath the authentication record. It displayed the internal executive credentials used during the final authorized revision only hours before the presentation. The account name was clear, complete, and impossible to misunderstand. It belonged to Victor Hale. The words on the forensic report seemed to suspend time itself. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted the silence. The digital signature remained glowing on the screen beneath the authenticated revision history, displaying Victor Hale's executive credentials with the precise timestamp recorded only hours before the presentation. Alexander Whitmore kept his eyes on the evidence for several seconds before looking toward Victor. There was no anger in his expression, only disappointment. Victor, he said quietly, this is your account. Victor stared at the screen without speaking. Grace Bennett remained perfectly composed. Would you like to explain why your credentials authorized the final revision containing financial figures that differed from the board-approved records? Victor slowly exhaled. Executive credentials can be compromised. Grace nodded. That is true. She turned toward the forensic examiner. Did you verify the authentication method? Yes, he answered immediately. The revision required multi-factor authentication using Mr. Hale's encrypted security token issued exclusively to his office. Victor answered calmly. Then someone may have accessed my office. The examiner shook his head. The authentication sequence also required a biometric confirmation recorded by the secure workstation assigned to executive finance. Alexander listened carefully without interrupting. Grace spoke again. Can biometric records be forged? Not within this system. Every authentication attempt is independently logged by the hardware security module. Another silence settled across the ballroom. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence that follows when facts begin speaking louder than explanations. Victor looked toward Alexander with the same composed expression he had carried all morning. I have served this company faithfully for 16 years. Alexander nodded once. You have. I helped build Whitmore Global into what it is today. You did. Would I risk everything for one presentation? Alexander answered gently. That is no longer the question before us. He stepped toward the conference table where the sealed evidence cases rested beside the printed reports, the recovered USB cap with its tiny purple ribbon, the reconstructed connection logs, and the forensic findings. The question is whether the evidence deserves to be ignored because we once trusted the person connected to it. Victor lowered his eyes without responding. Grace carefully organized every document into chronological order. Alexander, we now have independent witness testimony, physical evidence, preserved access records, recovered system logs, altered printed reports, concealed financial files, and authenticated editing records. Every element supports the others. Alexander looked across the ballroom before quietly making his decision. Notify the board of directors immediately. Preserve every electronic record associated with today's event. Suspend all financial announcements until the investigation is complete. Contact the appropriate regulatory authorities and provide full cooperation. Grace nodded, already being prepared. Victor remained standing without resistance. He looked less like a powerful executive now and more like a man watching years of carefully built certainty disappear beneath undeniable facts. Alexander turned toward him one final time. Everyone deserves fairness, Victor. That includes you. The investigation will continue through proper legal procedures, and every conclusion will be based on evidence, not assumptions. Victor slowly nodded. For the first time that day, he offered no further explanation. The ballroom became quiet once again. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, reflecting softly across the polished marble floor where only a few hours earlier hundreds of guests had expected to witness the largest announcement in the company's history. Instead, They had unknowingly witnessed something far more valuable. Alexander walked toward Maya Johnson. She instinctively took one small step backward, unsure why one of the most influential business leaders in America was approaching her. Alexander stopped a comfortable distance away before slowly lowering himself to one knee so they stood at eye level. "Maya," he said gently, "this morning you believed something was wrong even when every adult around you believed everything looked normal." Maya looked down at the faded purple bracelet wrapped around her wrist. "I just remembered what I heard." Alexander smiled softly. "You remembered because you cared enough to pay attention." Maya looked up. "I did not want anyone to get tricked." Alexander's expression warmed. "Neither do I." He carefully opened his hand. Resting on his palm was the tiny strand of purple ribbon that had started everything. Most people would have walked past something this small without noticing it. Maya smiled shyly. "My grandmother says little things tell big stories." Grace quietly smiled as she heard those words. Denise felt tears gathering in her eyes, not from sadness, but from relief that her daughter's courage had been met with respect instead of dismissal. Alexander stood and turned toward the remaining executives gathered inside the ballroom. Today, this company was not protected by wealth, technology, or authority. He looked back toward Maya. It was protected by honesty. Every person in the room looked toward the little girl wearing the oversized gray hoodie and the faded purple bracelet. Nobody saw a child standing beside a cleaning employee anymore. They saw the person who had refused to stay silent when silence would have been easier. Alexander extended his hand toward Denise. "Ms. Johnson, Whitmore Global will make sure neither you nor your daughter ever experiences consequences for doing the right thing." Denise accepted the handshake with quiet gratitude. Maya glanced one last time toward the dark presentation screen that had never displayed the false numbers prepared for that morning. The screen remained blank, reflecting only the people standing beneath it. Somehow that empty reflection felt more truthful than any polished presentation ever could. And in that peaceful silence, surrounded by evidence instead of illusion, Alexander understood that the greatest investment any leader could ever make was not in numbers, but in listening when the smallest voice in the room had the courage to whisper the truth.